Welcome, everybody, to Why Do You Pace? Part 2. I'm super excited. Like last episode, I'm going to keep Sam's spirits up because he's going to teach you some things. If you didn't see Part 1, go watch it. Sam's going to give a quick a summary on it, but it will really help your understanding, and it's just a great episode on its own. So if you missed that, if you really want to watch this episode, first, don't just 1.5 speed episode 1, and maybe you'll be able to retain some of it. But yeah, hopefully we can clue you in a little bit on why you're pacing, how you can write better designs, and how you can adjust your training to, get the most out of your time, and so you can get better. So yeah, Sam, why do we pace?
Why do we pace? What a great question. Well, as a quick to discuss like what we want to get into today, like the goal of this conversation. So we're going to do a little refresh on what we discussed last time. Then we're going to look more specifically at two terms that we talked about in the previous episode. And we're going to show examples of how that information can allow you to write training designs that can get somebody closer to the dose response you want, or at least give you a little more certainty around what's happening when they're executing that particular piece of work. So we're going to give a running high rocks type example, and then we're going to give more of a CrossFit type example. And those two terms were critical power, critical speed, which critical power is for machines like an erg or a cycle, rower, ski, etc., where you're measuring power in watts, and then critical speed being for running, where you're measuring meters per second. So we're talking about that, and then we're going to talk about W prime, which is, if you look in the literature, it's a W with like an apostrophe, but it's pronounced W prime. And so we're going to talk about that, which the simplest way of thinking about what that means or what it represents is a battery. It's literally your battery, your finite battery. So we're going to get into that. So our refresh, we started the episode last time with me trying to give you an analogy to distinguish the difference between sustainable and unsustainable with carrying your groceries. And what that got distilled down to was at certain loads or certain speeds, you can perform something almost indefinitely. And then at a certain point, you will predictably reach task failure or reach a VO2 max. Like you will cease performing the activity because of the speed being too high or the load being too high. And so there was a clear demarcation between sustainability and unsustainability with work. And then there are different degrees of unsustainability, which we talked about, where if you're close to that separation point, then you can go a little bit further and hold that pace for longer. But the further you move north of that pace, think, 100-meter sprint versus a 5K run, you are going to reach failure a lot more quickly. So the proximity to that separation point between sustainability and unsustainability influences how long you'll be able to perform a task. So that's something we're going to get into. And then that also led us to intensity domains. So there's different domains of intensity that influence what type of work you're going to be able to do at what type of rate. So using running as the example, if you're running a 100-meter sprint, you're working well above that sustainable metabolic rate. And so that's called the extreme intensity domain, where you'll reach task failure before you reach a VO2 max. Think of that as the top of the roof of your house. That's like your peak speed. That's the extreme intensity domain. And then your ceiling of your house is your severe intensity domain. So like from your ceiling all the way down to, say, your ground, the floor. That's your severe domain, where you're above critical power, you're above critical speed. So you will reach task failure once you hit a VO2 max. So think of a 2K row, 5K run, a 10-minute assault bike test. Any of those activities that are longer than 2 minutes up to 30, 40 minutes fall within that intensity domain, your severe intensity domain, which is, again, from the ceiling to the floor of your house. Beneath your floor representing your critical power, critical speed, which is the maximal sustainable metabolic rate, or highest sustainable metabolic rate would be a better way of wording it. That's your floor. Beneath that, so now you're getting into your like foundation of the house, or maybe a basement. Let's use a basement because in Arizona we don't have basements, so I'm not thinking about a basement. But for other parts of the country, they have basements. So you're getting into the basement. Now you're in the heavy domain, heavy intensity domain, which is a sustainable metabolic rate. So a 10K, a half marathon, a marathon. For some people, you're running in this domain where you can do it for long periods of time. You're not going to reach task failure. You're not necessarily going to reach. You're not going to reach a VO2 max. You will. You can if you start pushing the pace at the end, but we're not going to get into the details on that. But you're not. You're not going to be limited by those metabolic constraints that you would otherwise if you were in the severe domain or the extreme domain. And then you go beneath the basement and you actually have the foundation, let's say, of the house. That's representative of your moderate intensity domain, which is where your lactate threshold is, which is where you're maybe running the marathon for some people, or you're doing ultra distance running, or you're doing 5-6 hour hikes. This is the pace you can go for very, very long periods of time. And so that's another way of looking at these different domains through the lens of a house. You have the foundation, moderate intensity, you have the basement, heavy domain, heavy intensity. You have the ground floor, from the floor to the ceiling, the severe domain, and then the roof as your extreme intensity domain. So we're going to get specifically, we're going to look at critical power, critical speed, and then, if, like I said, W prime. So that's what we're going to get into today and try to, well, I'm going to try to articulate it clearly and give you something that you can take away with clients or with yourself. And I'm not going to get into the math on how to calculate your critical speed and critical power. Maybe we'll put that
pay
in
the big bucks for that.
Yeah, or you can just Google it.
It's too hard to Google.
Yeah.
Someone might give you a calculator, but if you want the real numbers, you're gonna have to reach out to us.
Yeah.
$20 a pop.
Do you want anything you wanted to add to that?
No, yeah, I think
anything that wasn't clear as you were listening.
No, yeah, I put the picture up, so
okay.
If you kind of remember from last week the intensity domains, and you can kind of see them, that's and you can just Google this, then it makes it easy to kind of think about if you're more visual. And I think the cool part today, which is the W prime, which we'll be getting into, which is this cool little, and don't let these confuse you or anything. It's very simple because Sam said it's just like a battery. And if you're thinking of it as a battery, then you'll have no issue. So yeah, I think it's super intriguing, and it definitely puts so much more context behind what you're doing, especially if you're exercising or you're running or you're doing CrossFit, or if you're on an erg, then it gives us so much context to what you're doing and what's happening, and gives you a better context of how to improve it and why you are pacing. So yeah.
So on the graph that's on the screen for those watching or those listening, on the y-axis there's power or speed, and then on the x-axis you have time, and then you have a curve, an asymptote that starts real high and then it comes down and then it reaches it never passes the line, but it goes out to like infinity. And so all the room underneath that curve is considered W prime. So that's your battery. And what's fascinating is it's a fixed amount of work that you can actually perform, and you can measure this in joules. But again, we're not going to get into the math because it's boring, but it's like you have a battery that has a fixed or finite amount of work that you can actually use, but based upon how fast you're going is going to influence how quickly you drain it or how not quickly you drain it, which is why proximity to critical power, critical speed, that line, will allow you to extend out the usage of that battery. So you can think about a phone. Again, you open all your apps, you turn up the brightness, you got Wi-Fi on, you're trying to stream, download. you're going to drain your battery super quick and then you're done. Whereas if you have all of that turned off and do the total opposite, you'll extend out that battery for a very long period of time. Your battery will last you, 2-3 days, something like that. So that's what we're seeing on this graph here. And so everything above this line, which this line is critical speed, critical power, is the severe domain. The extreme domain is not listed on here, but you can think of the extreme domain as being like just to the right of the starting point. Because again, that's maximal effort and intensity where you reach task failure before you reach VO2 max. So usually 90 seconds or less of activity maximally expressed falls into that domain. So all that severe. And then below the line, like we just talked about, is the heavy, and then the LT, GET, that's gas exchange threshold, and lactate threshold. That's the separation between heavy and moderate. So those are the two main physiological landmarks that really matter in respect to exercise physiology. Is critical power, critical speed, and lactate threshold. Like those two, because they separate two sections up here and two sections down here. If you understand those and have an idea of what's going on there, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So that's the graph. So from there, let's talk a little bit more specifically about critical speed, critical power. Let's get into what that is and how knowing about that can influence the training design. Because I want to keep this talk centered around the designs that we have to just show people, those listening, those watching, how you can leverage this information to write better designs to get people closer to the dose response you want.
Yeah.
So,
because that's what really matters. Can you write better
at the
designs?
End of the day,
can you improve your client, or can you improve?
Yeah. I mean, it's good to inform yourself and learn to better understand, understands the word of the day, because that's what this information is about, is trying to understand a little bit better, not perfectly, but a little bit better, what's happening physiologically as you're working, you're performing activity, so that you can take that knowledge, understanding, and apply it to your work with people to get them closer to the dose response you want, so that they can drive the adaptations you want to get them better. So that's what we're trying to do here. Okay, so what is critical speed, critical power? It's the highest sustainable metabolic rate. And metabolic rate is key here, because in exercise physiology, they're looking at when you're performing work, is your metabolic rate stabilizing? So think about lactate levels, think about oxygen uptake, think about heart rate, think about creatine phosphate, think about what would be another one? That's enough. So they're looking at these different markers to establish whether or not there's stability across each of them as you're working. Like, are they holding steady as you perform work at this pace, or are they continually creeping up? And we didn't plug in any papers here, but there's a ton of great papers where they show this perfectly, how, okay, at this one pace, all four of these markers are holding tight. Then we increase it by 5%, and all of a sudden, all the data points going up until they reach task failure. And it's so cool to see that there's like this super subtle change, and all of a sudden, metabolism just is going through the roof until you're done. And you know this intuitively, like the feeling of when you're doing an activity for an hour, and how maybe it's a little annoying, but you can keep going and you're not really going to hit a wall, versus when you're doing a 10-minute bike test or a 5K run, the difference in feeling and how your body's changing as that's going on, as you get to the end of that activity, and how it's like everything's going to a maximum because of what's happening physiologically in relation to where you are with respect to critical power, critical speed. So critical speed, critical power, which, worth noting, it's kind of a bandwidth. It's not like a very, very uber specific point, meaning 2 minutes per 500 is your critical power, and then 159, you're above it, so you're starting to drain. You're performing unsustainable work. It's a band, so you got to give yourself like plus or minus, a little bit up top, a little bit below it, but it's a band that represents the highest sustainable metabolic rate, the delineation between sustainability and unsustainability. And as I mentioned, which I'm saying it multiple times for a reason, your proximity to that value will influence how quickly fatigue will come on. So if you're way north of it, like doing a 100-meter sprint, you will reach task failure fatigue very, very quickly. Whereas if you're way south of it, like you're walking for 5 hours straight, you're going to go for a long period of time. So proximity in relation to critical speed, critical power will influence how quickly or not fatigue and task failure, oxygen uptake will come on. So how do you calculate this value? Because it's a value that can be calculated. That's the other super cool thing, is you don't need a metabolic cart. You don't need a lab. You just need a stopwatch, and you need full effort for 2 tests. So you need 2 tests that are between 3 and 20 minutes that are max effort. So for the running example, I have a 1K, and then I had the client of mine do a 5K because his 5K is right around 20 minutes, so it works. But you could also do a 3K run if people aren't that fast. So you take those 2 values, and then you do some math, which we're not going to get into, and it gives you your critical speed or critical power for doing rowing. And then with rowing, you can do a 5K and a 1K or a 2K. You do a 5K, 2K, that's fine.
Yeah, depending how fast you are.
Yep, depending on how fast you are. And so that's really insightful, because by getting that value, you now know what the maximal sustainable pace is for you on that erg or with running. And that's super important, especially in CrossFit, because that pace is going to be pretty close to what you're going to be holding for a lot of the work you do inside of classic Metcons or qualifiers, the open quarterfinals. Like 95% of the time, you're going to be working at a rate that falls around critical power or below it in the heavy intensity domain. You're not usually working above it in longer pieces of work. If it's a short sprint, that's different. But for 10, 15, 20-minute pieces, the pace you're picking is usually in the heavy domain, which is going to be right below critical power, critical speed, depending upon your fitness level. So if we can calculate that, then now not only does the client athlete have a better sense of, okay, this pace is around where I'm at when I'm in those environments. So I should be around that pace. That's like my sweet spot to be at. And then when I'm writing designs, I could build things off of that to go, well, I want him to work for 3 minutes in the severe intensity domain to drain some of his battery, to create some fatigue. And then he's going to go in and do more pulling to challenge that. Or I want him to work for 5 minutes in the heavy intensity domain. So it's sustainable, but it's creating some fatigue. But then I'm going to have him go off and then do work that's unsustainable for 5 minutes. So I'm front loading some fatigue, but it's not so much where it's going to influence the output after that. So that's what's really interesting about this. You can also do a 3-minute max effort test. You can YouTube this to see this in action. Again, you have to do it.
Just do it.
You have to do it. So the value, this is actually really important, because people make this mistake all the time when they talk about zones, and they think that your zones in one discipline apply to all disciplines, which is false. Your heart rate curve zones is unique to the discipline. So your heart rate profile for running is not the same as rowing. It's not the same as cycling. It's not the same as swimming. So if you're going to use those, you have to find a max heart rate and create your heart rate profile if you want to do that. So if you're going to do the tests that we've just laid out, 2 tests, 3 minutes to 20 minutes, max effort time trial, that's going to represent your critical power for rowing. That's going to represent your critical speed for running. So that value doesn't apply to other things. It's very important. So with the 3-minute max effort test, if you do it on a C2 bike, that's going to be your critical power for the C2 bike. It's not going to be your critical power for rowing. So just don't make that mistake of thinking that there's applicability across disciplines. It doesn't work that way. Want to go to the next slide?
Someone could just do that test,
Do
please.
test. Okay, so this is example 1. This is a client of mine. He trains for High Rocks. He recently did one 62 minutes. So he's pretty good. Yeah, he's legit. So he's not a beginner by any means. So he these are a little bit older. I think we did these in the spring, so I need to update this. But he did a 1K time trial, 3:30, 5K, 20:41. So that put his critical speed around 4:08, which is right around his 10K PR. He did a 10K a few months ago. I think it was a 4:09 or a 4:10. So his critical speed's probably improved a little bit. And this is around the pace. It's a little bit faster than the pace he tries to run in High Rocks, which is why a 10K is a great metric for High Rocks, because your pace, well, one, it's in the heavy intensity domain. So the pace for the 10K is a sustainable metabolic rate, which is important. It's also going to be close to what you should be running in High Rocks. It's probably a little faster, but you should be close to it, which is why I think that's the best KPI for High Rocks. So in the example, he's doing 2 sets. He's rowing 1,000 meters at 2 minutes per 500, which is heavy intensity domain for him. So that's sustainable. So he's going to be rowing for pretty much 4 minutes. So I'm giving him 4 minutes of work at a sustainable rate, but it's still going to get oxygen uptake elevated. So his breathing's a bit higher. It's going to create some fatigue. Then I'm going to have him go run 1,500 meters at 3:50 to 4 minutes per kilometer, which is in the severe intensity domain. So this is around his 5K time trial pace. So he's already done. So I've given him 4 minutes of work. That's not unsustainable. So it's not going to be depleting his battery, but it's creating some fatigue so that when he starts his run, the run's going to feel a little bit harder, and it's going to challenge him a little bit more than if I had him do 1,500 meters fresh at that pace. And so now he's getting 4, and then he's going to get another 6, so about 10 minutes of work. So he's getting about 10 minutes of work, and he's going to rest 4 to 5 minutes. And like we might have talked about this last time. If not, one of the ways you increase critical power, critical speed is you need to spend time with oxygen uptake elevated quite high. And the way you do that mainly is longer intervals that are in the severe intensity domain. So instead of giving him 10 minutes of running in the severe intensity domain, which would be a lot and challenging, I bias heavy intensity work to get oxygen uptake elevated so it's higher, so that when he does the running, his system's already elevated. So he's already pushing on his ceiling quite a bit, which is good, without him having to do a lot more running in one bout. And that allows me to give him more sets of work. So he does that, rests 4 to 5 minutes. Then he does it with the ski erg on the front end. Same thing, 1,000 meters, 205, heavy intensity for him. And then he's going to go run again at that pace, rest 4 to 5 minutes. So he's getting 6K of running around his 5K race pace, which is great. That's a lot of good training. And he's getting about 40 minutes of work in, which is great. So this is like a Wednesday session for him. The next day is a rest day. So he's getting a lot of running in, but I'm contextualizing the running because he needs to be good at running when he's tired. And so this is how I can use the knowledge of his critical power, critical speed to give him paces that get the dose response that I'm aiming for. Because again, it's not perfect because I don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm getting closer to the bullseye.
Yeah, and not just fatigue and running, because you contextualized it to the race as well, like coming off a row into the run,
exactly,
run, because you could you could do anything, and anyone could do anything to make yourself tired and then run. Because
Yep.
that's what people think. It's like, all right, I improved my running a bit, and now I'm just going to do it and add fatigue, which in
Yep.
theory is right. But then when a lot of people think that, they're like, I'm just going to do an EMOM of like 30-second run hard and then 30-second burpees or something, and they're just gonna, they'll just pick whatever because they think any fatigue is an improvement to the run.
Mm-hmm. Well, and those intervals aren't long enough.
Yeah, but I was
You need to work.
that's what people are thinking.
Yeah.
They're thinking just any fatigue, where you now have layered it to you're
Yeah.
fatiguing it in a very specific domain that's helping you use less time in the severe domain. And another
Mm-hmm.
layer is now they're preparing for high
Yeah.
rock, so you're improving the row and the ski at the same time. So it's
Mm-hmm.
40
Yep.
minutes is packed of very proficient work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you bring up a good point. If people are thinking that, which I agree with you, I think people do think that way, is you have to go further with that thought. You can't just stop at, well, I need fatigue, so I'm going to just do burpees and then run. Like you got to push yourself to think more about what am I actually trying to do? Like what am I actually trying to change? Am I trying to improve my running? Okay, if so, how am I trying to improve my running? Like what is lacking there? Or am I trying to improve my burpees? What specifically is going on? Like you got to take it another step or two to really think or figure out like what's really the problem here. And then that'll allow you to get closer to the solution you need. So you got to ask better questions to get better answers. And that's what this is all about, is we're trying to ask better questions. Like, why do we pace? And then from that, we can start getting into things that are getting us closer to a better answer, which then gives us the opportunity to create training that gets them closer to it. So that was the running example specific for high rocks. Now we're going to move to more of a CrossFit specific example. So this is a client of mine, multi-time semifinal athlete. He has a 2K row 628, is a 5K row 1742, which gives him a critical power around 152 plus or minus 3 seconds. So again, that represents highest sustainable metabolic rate. He could probably hold that for a 10K if he wanted to, if he was motivated to do it. Like he has the physiology to do something like that. So it's going to be reflective of 40, 45 minutes of work that he can perform. So I can take that information and I can write designs that challenge him, where I leverage the row. So I use a general challenge to challenge him specifically. So like a general tool to challenge him with a specific tool. So in the example, 5 sets, he's going to row 200 meters at a 145, which is severe intensity domain, which is, I think, right around, maybe that's actually probably a little bit faster than his 5K PR pace. So knowing that means that at that pace, I have 5,000 meters in the bank that I could use if there was no rest. So of course, when I add rest, I'm recuperating some of that battery, but not a ton. So it's not like 1 for 1. Like if I, work for 5 minutes at the severe intensity domain and then I rest 5 minutes, I get the 5 minutes back. It's not a 1 for 1 exchange. So he's doing 200 meters rowing at, let's say, his 5K PR pace, which is severe intensity. It's unsustainable. Then he's going into 7 toes to bar, 5 chest to bar, 3 bar muscle ups, which are all extreme intensity domain. So unsustainable, high threshold movements. They're going to cause a lot of fatigue. It's all pulling. So he's doing 200 meters of pulling. He's doing 15 reps of high pulling, challenging pulling, and then he's doing 200 meters additionally of rowing at a 145 for 500. So he's doing 130. He's doing about 2 minutes of pretty challenging pulling, and then he's resting 2 to 4 minutes for 5 sets. So I'm giving him 2,000 meters of rowing at his 5K pace, and then he's getting 75 reps of work on the bar that, while at face value is not a lot of reps for somebody like him, like 75 reps is like, it's not too much. But when I place it in this type of fashion, I make the 75 reps feel really challenging. Like it now feels like 150 reps. So I don't have to give him so much work to challenge him with these movements. And that's great too, because you want to be smart with how you're allocating volume, because for obvious reasons, for joint health, for progression purposes, for longevity of the person. So using cyclical tools and then understanding the domains that the different levels of intensity reside in, I can create fatigue prior to him doing work that allows me to constrain how much I'm going to give him. So he's still getting a really good dose response, but not all of the wear and tear that he would accumulate if he was doing 150, 200 reps on the bar. Not to say that there aren't periods of times where you might want to build in volume to 100, 150 reps, but you don't need to be doing that week in, week out, or every other month. Like that's, like how can I get more out of less? Especially in a sport that is very volume heavy and a lot of eccentric loading. That's a really important thing to be thinking about, is like, how can I make half of this volume feel like the full thing? So that's one way we can use critical speed, critical power to create that sensation.
Yeah, if you were able just to hold the functional volume of each movement year round, then then it just wouldn't be, you probably wouldn't be able to get the stimulus anymore to grow. You'd need to go past that and keep going past that.
Exactly. Exactly. You'd start regressing, because like you have to overload in some way. So if I'm using half of the volume, again, 75 reps here, I have a ton of space to progress this. And versus if I gave him 150 reps, it's like, well, how many am I going to do next week? 175. What about the next week? 200. Now he's done, almost 450 reps in 3 weeks. His elbows and rotator cuff's going to be really pissed off. Like,
what's the term? Not like trash volume. What is it? I can't.
Junk volume.
Junk volume. Yeah, I'm so far from that, I don't even remember it. But that's like when I hear people say, they're like, yeah, no, like I'm doing like 100 to 120 muscle ups a week. Like I'm holding that, like every week for training. You have to, and I'm just like, you're doing that at a cost. You're not doing that because you're good. It's like if you could do 120 for 3 weeks in a row and that it took you a year to build that up and you were fine, that would be something that's pretty impressive. But just getting them in and checking them off, like, yeah, I did my 120 this week, I'm getting better. That does not equate. That's like the same thing as like a sprinter saying, I put in a 50-mile week. A sprinting coach would be like, why would you sprint 50 miles or not sprint? Why would you log 50 miles?
Yeah. You want to be, you got to put more intention in what you're doing. You can't just bang your head against the wall. It doesn't work.
Now I know a few people are thinking, I am W prime, me, and you're looking at him, but jokes aside, it's something different.
That's what you should have put as your subtitle.
A picture of me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're doing good on time, because I think we can get through this.
I think we can wrap it up. Yeah.
10 minutes. Okay, so again, the best. Hold on, let me take a breath for a second. Okay. So critical power, critical speed, which are synonymous, they represent the separation between sustainable and unsustainable work. They represent the highest sustainable metabolic rate you can maintain for the given discipline you're performing. Constant work, that's the key. And we're not even going to get into how this applies to gymnastics, weightlifting, because we're not going to go there. We're just focusing right now on like ergs, running, just right there. It's easy to wrap our head around that. So above that line, like we talked about, you're in the severe intensity domain, you're working on borrowed time, you're starting to drain your battery, and that finite battery is called your W prime. So what is your W prime? Let's get a little bit more specific. Give your next slide. Okay. So it's a finite amount of work that can be performed above critical power in one bout. That's super important. For example, let's say you're rowing. Let's say your critical power is 2 minutes per 500. So at 2 minutes, you're good. You're maintaining a stable metabolic rate. You drop to 155. Now you're in the severe intensity domain. You're starting to drain W prime, the battery. If you jump back to 2 minutes or to 202, you've moved out of the severe intensity domain. You've moved out of draining the battery, and you're actually going to start to slowly recover the battery, very slowly. Because remember, proximity to critical power influences how quickly you drain the battery or how quickly you recover the battery. So if you dropped it back to 250 per 500, you will recover it a lot more quickly. The fastest way you'll recover it is if you just get off the rower and not work. So one continuous bout, you have to be staying in that domain from start to finish. So a 2K row is a great example. Like that's a test that's fully comprised of working in the severe intensity domain, because you're going to reach a VO2 max and you're going to drain your battery completely by the end of it. So a battery, it drains, it replenishes. It's really important to remember, which is why, like I mentioned earlier, if you're doing work in a CrossFit workout or the open or the quarterfinals, you're probably not rowing or riding the bike in the severe domain, because you don't want to be draining the battery while you're doing that machine, because you're going to be draining the battery with everything else you're doing. So you almost intuitively, you pick a pace that's in the heavy domain, because that allows you to replenish some of the battery a little bit. And the big difference being that people who are more elite or more fit, the pace that coincides with the heavy intensity domain is just a lot higher than yours. So their critical power is just really, really high, which is the adaptation that you want in endurance training. Is you're wanting to shrink the W prime, and you're wanting to raise critical power. So I want the floor of my house to get closer to my ceiling. That's what we want. We don't want the house to get the ceilings to get higher necessarily. We do want the ceiling to go up, which could represent like your VO2 max, but we want to do that in concert with bringing the floor up to the ceiling. So like we want them to come together. And without going down a rabbit hole, increasing VO2 max will raise critical power. So we'll leave that there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a on new cars, fancy cars. When you're driving, you can see the miles per gallon. Once you start going up, above, let's just call it 70 miles per hour, it starts to drop. Like you're using a ton of resources just to go a little bit faster. Versus if you were to slow down, you're using less resources, and you can extend it out a bit. Because like you said, it's finite. Well, you're going to run out. Whereas if you were if you were idling and just rolling, you could kind of go for a long time.
That's the only reason
I think of it as numbers.
Yeah, and that's the only reason I'm not as quick to use the car as an analogy, because
there's holes in it.
Well, the gas tank is limited, but theoretically, if you're well below critical power, critical speed, you can go really, really, really long. It's almost like you're starting to get fuel from the sun. Like you have solar.
Yeah, the analogy would be better if it was an electric vehicle and it had some way of recharging. If you're under 30 miles per hour, it can recharge itself to the point where it can continue forever. Yes. We're getting there soon. We should start a car company called W Prime.
There'd be like 3 people who bought a car, and we would all think it was super cool. Okay, so back on course. It's a battery. It drains. It replenishes. It drains when you're above critical power. It replenishes when you're below critical power. The more you drain it, the slower it will replenish. So if you do a 20-second all-out sprint, you will drain it significantly, and the replenishment of that will be really slow. For example, if I ask you to sprint for 20 seconds as hard as possible, and then I ask you to rest for 40 seconds and do it again, you will not repeat the 20-second output that you did the first time. You'll probably tear your hamstring, but you'll go a lot slower. And so this is a problem with the Tabata idea, is if you actually did 10 seconds all out, rest 20 seconds, and then repeated that 8 times, you're not really actually going all out because you can't recuperate the battery sufficiently in the rest time. It's not enough rest. So that's one of the problems with people thinking that, or not so much.
Science.
Yeah, it's not so much the Tabata protocol. Well, one, I don't think it's very helpful or useful,
Just
but
the
also
idea of thinking you're doing high
max effort. That's the key. It's the language. It's like it's the wrong. You could say 10 seconds really high effort, which is fine, but when you say max effort, I think people have a disconnect between like max effort and like what that actually is. Because like if it's really max effort,
and even that, it's still not the best approach.
No. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
but
it's gonna hype me up.
Yeah. So the point being, if you drain, the more you drain it, the slower it will deplenish. The size of the battery is largely dependent on individual genetics and training status. So, for example, high power, if you're fast, low fatigue resistant individual, you probably have a low critical power and you have a very high W prime. Perfect example of this type of person would be 100-meter sprinters. Yeah. They are high power, lots of fast twitch muscle fiber, low fatigue resistance. They perform all of their activities in pretty much the extreme intensity domain, especially the 100-meter, 200-meter sprinters. Even technically, you could say the 400-meter sprinters as well. But that probably gets a little gray because NFL players like people who have a propensity for speed and power. They have a really big battery, but very low critical power. And that's why they don't do endurance training. Whereas on the other side of the coin, lower power, more enduring, high fatigue resistant individual, they're going to have a super high critical power and a very small W prime. So the marathon world record holders, 10K, half marathon professionals, 5K, this is the type of individual that sits inside of this bucket. I mean, it's super fascinating when you look at the research on what pace, and I think I talked about this last time, and I've posted about it on Instagram, like what pace the world record marathon runners hold in relation to their critical speed. Like it's like 2 to 3 percentage points below their critical speed for 2 hours, to the point where if they went 3 or 4 seconds faster per kilometer, they would drain their battery in like 400 meters. So they literally go 3 to 4 seconds slower and they can run for 2 hours continuously. And if they go 2 to 3 seconds faster, they slow down after 400 meters. Like that's the adaptation that you're trying to go for with endurance training, is you're trying to minimize how much finite work you can do, or well, that's the wrong word, unsustainable work that you can perform. The battery will begin to recover the moment your power output drops below critical power. That's super important to know, which is why, back to CrossFit, when you're doing work in an AMRAP, a test, whatever it might be, you're probably going to be below critical power for that activity because you're wanting to recharge the battery because you're going to go drain it with the other movements you're doing. And I got to say one caveat here, because for those that are somewhat informed of this already, they're going to call me on this. Everything you do has its own battery. So you don't have like a universal battery per se. So, but they play off of each other. They influence each other. So if Roman's doing an 18-minute AMRAP of rowing, toes to bar, and power clean and jerks, all three of those are going to have their own battery, but they're all going to influence each other a little bit. Meaning the toes to bar, the battery is going to be very small, which is why you're, of course, going to partition it or break it up to ensure you can extend out the work that you can perform there. The clean and jerk obviously has a very finite battery as well. And then the rower, of course, is very, you can manipulate it because he can slow down a lot and it becomes a lot more sustainable, or he can go fast and now he's draining it. So if he goes too fast on the rower, he's draining it there. Then he goes to the toes to bar. He's going to be draining on the toes to bar. He has fatigue from the rower accumulating. So now his grip's really falling apart. Then he goes to the clean and jerk. He's probably going to naturally slow down on the clean and jerk because his body's needing to recuperate some of that battery he's training. So the better approach, which is what most people do instinctually, especially if they're trained, they go pretty quick on the toes to bar and the clean and jerk, and then they pull back a little bit on the row so that the row's in the heavy intensity domain so he can keep working, and then he goes fast in the other implements. And then what you're trying to do over time as you get better is you're just raising that pace you can go at that's still in the heavy domain. So 2 years ago, maybe it's like a 155 for him. Now it's a 151. And that's improvement in fitness because his sustainable rate on the machine has gotten faster. And that's what you're wanting to do.
And like inversely, if you did, 20 bicep curls and then 20 air squats, they'll have a small effect, but the effect is much different than, the examples you just gave. So you could still, that's like an opposing thought of your batteries of like your arms versus your legs.
Yes. Yeah. So then that's why with complementary patterns. So like if you do the upper body and the lower body, squatting and pulling, bending and pushing, you'll be able to accumulate a lot more work because when you're doing the air squats, your arms are recovering. And then when you go do your bicep curls, your legs are recovering. And so that's one way. And as you become more fit, you do that even faster. Like the recovery process increases the speed. Whereas when you're less fit, you're not really recovering the legs that much when you do the bicep curls and vice versa. So that's one adaptation you're trying to develop. And then once you become really good at that, then you challenge yourself further by doing bicep curls and kettlebell swings because now the arms are getting fatigued in both of them. And so you're trying to make the contractions closer to critical power. So you either do that through we're not going to get into that, but that's the training adaptation that you're trying to go after. Okay, so back on track. Critical power and W prime are inversely related. So if you're increasing W prime, if you're making your battery bigger, then your amount of sustainable work is getting smaller. So again, if you're going for a power type sport, a power type discipline, you're wanting to increase W prime. So your critical power will get lower or drop, which is good. That's what you want. If you're in an endurance-based sport like CrossFit, running, high rocks, triathlon, skiing, cross-country skiing, cycling, you want your W prime to be getting smaller and smaller. Like you want more work that you perform to be sustainable for obvious reasons. Okay, how training will influence W prime. So the more endurance training, the critical power will increase, the W prime will decrease. So as your general fitness improves through endurance training, let's say, remember the floor is going to get closer to the ceiling, which is good. We want that. Again, in the context of endurance. The amount, and this was the little note I wrote, the amount of work that can be performed sustainably increases the adaptation you want with endurance-based activities. You want to be able to do more work that's sustainable. Back to the marathon runner example. From a 4:30 mile pace all the way up to a 10-minute mile pace is sustainable for them. Like they have this large range of work that they can do that's sustainable. And then obviously faster than 4:30 is not sustainable. Most people doing a half marathon, a marathon, anything faster than an 8:30 mile is not sustainable. Like they're starting to drain the battery. So just think of that as like a thought experiment of how much range the elite marathon runner has of sustainable work, which is why they can do so much volume. Because it's all 95% of it is sustainable. So they're recovering faster. That's the big one. Recover faster, less stress on the system. So that's also why we're trying to increase critical power. And then over time, as workload accumulates in one given session or effort, critical power and W prime will decrease. So to give an example, and this was great because Tadej Pogacar talked about this when he was interviewed by Peter Tia recently. And he was saying how on a zone 2 bike ride, he'll go 5 hours at like 350 watts, which is insane. It's insane. And what he said, whether or not he knows this, is he perfectly described durability. He said to Peter, like, yeah, so I go 5 hours, 350 watts. And he said, but, by the last few hours, 350 watts is no longer zone 2. It's now like zone 3. Because as workload increases, your physiological thresholds start to they start to drop. So your critical power used to be 2 minutes per 500, but an hour and a half into working, now your 2 minutes per 500 is in the severe domain. It's starting to creep up. And now your critical power is actually more like 210. So this becomes important inside of longer endurance-based activities. So with clients of mine that do half marathons, triathlons, this is more important, like over an hour. Inside of an hour, not so much. But from a CrossFit lens, you can think about it over like a multi-day competition. I know I wrote like in one given session or effort, because between the sessions or between the events and the days, you're going to recuperate your battery. But that's in one line of thinking. That's what we're trying to do through training is build durability so that over 3 days and 8-9 events, you're maintaining most of your physiological characteristics so that by the last day, you have a lot of resources still available to compete. So we're trying to do that in a different way through training, but in very traditional endurance-based disciplines, that's a facet that you're trying to develop. Fatigue resistance, which is also called durability, which maybe we'll do an episode on that. But
yeah,
that's
we did one a long time ago, but I think we could do another one soon too.
Oh, we did.
It'll tie in. Yeah, we did one, maybe 8 months ago or so.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that would be good.
Yeah.
And I think ties in well, but we still got a few more to go here. But yeah, the battery, the W prime, hopefully that made sense to most people. If you want it to make sense and if you want to learn, then you'll understand it, or you'll start to grasp it more. I think that's one of the biggest issues is some people want to learn and some people think they want to learn or think that they want to understand how to improve, but really they just, I don't, maybe it's my own bias too, but some people just want to affirm what they're doing and, think that they are getting better. Because it is hard, because if you're learning something new and you're already training or you're already coaching, likely you're acknowledging that you're maybe doing something wrong now, or maybe just less efficient and could improve. So part of you has to give up something.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, you have to be comfortable letting go of something to be able to grasp onto something else, and something else being better or closer to truth, which is important.
Yeah, closer.
Yeah, closer to truth. And it is uncomfortable because you could be comfortable or efficient with how you do things now, because when you learn something new, it's going to jumble up your thought process and your mental models of how you design or approach training. So that can be bumpy at first, but through enough iterations and time and learning, it'll get a little bit smoother. And now it's like you've reached another level of efficiency and understanding, which is great. And there should be multiple iterations of that in your coaching practice and career. Like that's how you're going to keep getting closer to mastery.
Mastery, the strive.
Yes.
All right.
The worthy path.
Great episode. Nothing to add, I don't think. And I think this will segue good into the next one. Hopefully everyone's continuing to learn. Like we just said, just got to keep wanting to learn to improve either your own fitness or those who you're working with. So yeah, if you have any questions, shoot us a comment. If you are listening to this, there's no way you don't have questions or thoughts. So just do it. Just man up or woman up and throw us a comment down. and let us know what you're thinking. But we really appreciate you listening. Sorry, this one went a little long, and we're excited to see you guys on the next one.